Daniel Boyarin is a Taubman Professor of Talmudic Culture in the departments of Near Eastern Studies and Rhetorics in the University of California, Berkeley. He has been, among other things, a fellow of the National Endowment for the Humanities twice, a Guggenheim Fellow, a fellow of the Institute for Advanced Studies in Jerusalem, a holder of the Berlin Prize at the American Academy of Berlin, a senior Alexander von Humboldt Fellow at the Freie Universität in Berlin, and a Ford Foundation Fellow. He's the author of Dying for God, Martyrdom and the Making of Christianity in Judaism, The Jewish Gospels, The Story of the Jewish Christ, A Radical Jew, Paul and the Politics of Identity, and many other books. So please help me welcome our respondent. And we said that we would end 1:30. However, I don't need 10 minutes to say Enli Milim. I lack words, so please feel free to use more than 20 minutes.
Daniel, you're muted.
Am I hearable now?
Speak very close to your microphone.
Okay. I'm going to unplug my
and speak into the microphone of the computer. Is that working better now?
Yes.
Okay. Is it better? Good.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, I won't need too much time either. I've got a couple of brief comments that I would have made during the sessions or during the Q&A, but I didn't want to steal my own thunder and have nothing to say. And then I have one, I think, more general point to make. First of all, I want to say that I met Professor Svartvik through his work. And I think this is the first time we've had any face-to-face interaction. If I'm wrong, chalk it up to my impending dementia. But and what I read of Svartvik and enjoyed so much was his writing on Mark 7, a chapter that I've done significant writing about as well. And I think he was genuinely one of the first Christian scholars of New Testament. And I'm including in this absolutely first-rate scholars of Mark, people for whom I have enormous respect, who actually understood the context of Jesus's argument with the Pharisees there. So I am pleased very much to have met you. I want to apologize briefly to Professor Svartvik for an intemperate comment I made about Daniel Deronda that thought that the historical significance to which he was pointing was its authorization of Zionism. And I appreciate very much his pointing out that George Eliot is one of the first, at least nominally, Christian authors who has really paid sympathetic attention to the textures of Jewish life and the importance of mitzvot, of commandments in our lives. So I had an uncle of my father who used to read George Eliot from beginning to the end. He had the complete set, and then when he got to the end, he would start reading it again. For his entire life. He was not a religious Jew, but he saw, having read Daniel Deronda, he thought that she was someone who needed to be paid attention to that extent. I don't necessarily want to talk about particular papers, although I would point out that Elie Wiesel is hardly an example of love and compassion, and we could get into an extended discussion of that, but we have to be careful in choosing our examples as well. So the rest of what I have to say is a kind of general methodological comment that grows out of Dan's paper as well, or connects to Dan's paper, because I think he gets it just right. It's not a question, however, I want to contextualize that statement. It's not a question of, do you read the parable allegorically or do you not read it allegorically, or what precisely allegory means in that context. It is a question of the context that we interpret that parable within, the historical context. And we start, I think, by not referring to texts of the 1st and 2nd century, or until the middle of the 2nd century, as Christian texts, but understand very clearly that these are texts that are produced not outside of Judaism. I have problems with that term since there was no organized Judaism at the time. But within a Jewish world, all of the protagonists are Jewish, all of the speakers are Jewish, Jesus is Jewish, Paul is Jewish, all the gospel writers are Jewish, everyone there are Jewish. Once we make that shift in our minds, and this is a kind of a conceptual shift that has to be made, then it is impossible to read these texts as supersessionist. They must be read as conflict texts within the world of Jewish thought and practice in the 1st century. Once we have made that move again, then we can find as well historical context for most of the details of the arguments. For instance, over the purity of foods, in coming back again to Mark 7, this is a battle between a certain kind of Pharisaic thought, and Pharisee here is not a pejorative, and the thought of most other Jews who would have been on Jesus' side with respect to purity and impurity of foods. Everyone is Jewish in these stories. So the rejection of one group for another group is not a priori, cannot be read as rejection of the Jews, but some sort of internal conflicts. I have no reason not to think not in good faith between different Jewish traditions, different Jewish practices, some of them perhaps regional, Galilean versus Yahud, between the people who are called Amei Haratzot, that is, the Jews who did not go into exile in Babylonia, and Jews who did and came back several hundred years before this, etc. So within that context, Dan's reading of the parable makes a great deal of sense. I might dispute this detail or that detail. I think perhaps he overdoes the specifics of everything pointing to a particular referent, but he is reading it from my point of view, or in my humble point of view, as usual, that's more ironic than other, the right context for reading the New Testament. The New Testament, I claim, is a Jewish book. As for what happens, beginning with figures like Melito of Sardis or Justin Martyr, and then into the Chrysostoms and etc. That's another matter of history. That's a matter of historical reception that it really seems to me to be a separate issue from the issue of historical New Testament interpretation. And that's what I have to say. So I wish to honor what I hear here and what I know from Svartvik, and what I know from Daniel's work in the past, and what he had to say today, and Mary Boyce's call that anyone who claims to be a serious scholarly New Testament scholar pay very, very close, wide, and broad attention, not to the conditions from which Christianity emerged, but to the conditions within which the New Testament texts were first promulgated. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed for your comments and insights. We do have a few minutes. I'm looking at Ruth now, whether we should open the floor for more questions and comments. And while Ruth thinks about this, I could mention that we actually have met once before. It was on a direct flight, Lufthansa, from Frankfurt to Denver. And I was starstruck when I saw you many years ago. So I saw, are you on your way to Denver? And you looked at me as someone who is less than intelligent. Of course you were, because everyone on that flight was on the way to Denver. Where else would one go? So that we were sitting next to each other, and you were working with two computers, I think, all night, and I was sleeping and enjoying a movie. So that gave Ruth a few seconds here. Should we open the floor, or should we call it a day?
We can open the floor. And also we were going to make the breakout rooms available afterwards, in any case, for anybody who would like to hang out and visit for a few more minutes. But let's see whether there are responses, questions, thoughts.
I just want to thank Daniel for your feedback, your affirmation. To be honest, I was writing this essay with your own scholarship in the back of my mind about being very careful about who I'm describing as whom. I also take your comment about detailed reference in the allegory under advisement. Thank you.
I have something which is a semi-formed question, but listening to this conversation as someone who's a somewhat informed outsider to it, I'm wondering to what extent the question that we're asking, or that Jesper's asking, is inherently Protestant, in that we are saying that going back to the original meaning, or retrieving an original meaning, is then something which is formative and important for the church and the direction that the church can be going. And I'm coming at this from a Jewish perspective, saying that many of the Christian Jewish disputations that I've studied in the Middle Ages are claiming that Judaism is illegitimate because it moves away from biblical Judaism, because the scriptural text is no longer the absolute determination of what Jews do, and therefore Jews who are post-biblical Jews, Jews who are rabbinic Jews, are therefore illegitimate in the eyes of medieval Christians. And that's a trope that recurs and comes back. I think that for Catholics to be saying, the tradition of the church is problematic, and therefore, Dan alluded to this, that there's certain questions that are easier to ask as Protestants than they are to ask as Catholics. How does one criticize the tradition? And how does one determine where legitimacy lies? And I think those are sort of meta questions that we're playing with, but might might be useful to name them.
May I say something?
Sure.
I think that that's a little backwards for our present situation. The question is not to say to Protestants or Catholics, you've got the Gospels wrong, so change your whatever because you've departed from the true meaning of the gospel. The point is to address people, particularly people of goodwill, Christians of goodwill, who are troubled by the fact that they believe, have been taught that their gospels teach them anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism. And those are the people that when we show them that the gospels themselves do not commit them to the hateful things that they've been taught, they commit them to, it's actually a relief. And that is generally, I think, the practice of the possibility of radical rereading, of feminist reading or queer reading, or is to open up possibilities for change that we are desiring and needing to make already.
How does that work with the question that Peter raised of Pentecostal and some evangelical Christians? That works very well for people who are looking for this solution.
First, I have to persuade them not to vote for Trump. I mean, we're talking about cultural differences that are so deep and wide, in which my ethical concerns are entirely of the devil from their perspective. Right? So that's a different question. But first, let's start with people, and there are so many, and you know them too, of course, of Christians of genuine goodwill, for whom the opening up of the New Testament text to Jewish context, and showing that when in John, I like to say, you are of your father the devil, proves that he's Jewish. That's the way Jews talk to each other when they get really angry, right? Which defangs, detoxifies for people who don't want the toxic, already know they don't want the toxic.
May I add something? I think you're correct that, I mean, the Corcoran chair, the research project of the current Corcoran chair, it is a Protestant endeavor to a high degree. If one would like to do some matchmaking, Judaism and Catholicism are close to each other in terms of how tradition is balanced in scripture, etc. And I would say Islam and Protestantism are closer to that. We constantly need to go to, we have this yearning for the sources and read and find the original meaning, and we look for something that, if we don't like it, we say it's later. Either we find it in scripture, or we find it beneath, under the surface, and the oral tradition and the pre-Markan or the historical Jesus. And that has been the liberation theology of Protestantism, to go beneath, to go beyond, to look for the teaching of the historical Jesus. So I would say it is to a very high a degree a Protestant endeavor, but I think it is correct. That is where we are now. Not only Protestants, but all biblical scholars seek to go looking not only for a contemporary non-supersessionist reading, but a pre-supersessionist reading. That, of course, we have, as Daniel said, supersessionism, Melito and Justin and etc. But I don't think we have it to the same extent in the New Testament or the earliest layers of the New Testament, and therefore we have to go back in order not only to find what is as I said, ethically justifiable, but also what's historically plausible. We can't read it as if it were a discussion between Protestants and a few token Jews who were Pharisees or chief priests, because it's an inner Jewish discussion, as Paula Fredrickson said in a similar way, that we have to remember that the New Testament is a bunch of Jews yelling at each other.
Exactly.
It's the same approach. I often think of Walter Kasper's speech that he gave on the day of Nostra Aetate at Boston College, when he said both that we are grateful for Nostra Aetate because it reminds us that when we look, we rediscovered Jews as sisters and brothers. But he also said that it is a sacrament of every otherness, that as such the church must learn to discern, recognize, and celebrate. So those are the two arguments. If you could say the Protestant argument is to say we have to go back in history and look at Jews and Christians as siblings. It's an inner family affair, and siblings argue that's by definition how things work in life. And the Catholic approach is to look for a contemporary sacramental way of looking at the other, and that is what he says. So it's a sacramentum, it's a sacrament of every otherness that the church has to recognize, etc. And I believe both those are necessary. We can go back in a time machine and we'll find something that is pre-supersessionist, but we also need to have a more ecclesiological, if that's the word in English, approach to the other, not only looking in the text. And therefore I like this, the other as a sacramentum, something that is given to you, life enhancing, never can be comprehended, received, it's lechaim, it's for life. And that is what sacramentum is to Christians, and that is what Judaism is to Christianity.
We have a comment in the chat from Michael Lazar, who says we're overlooking Orthodox Christian traditions, and I will take the blame for that, but I'm wondering whether Michael would like to speak to that.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I've heard it in a few of the comments, but when Jesper noted that the similarity between Judaism and Catholicism on one side and then Protestantism and Islam on the other, I mean, I'm a little taken aback because Orthodox Christianity still has a very common, I mean, a firm element or understanding of tradition, but no magisterium. And to me, that would bear, you know, in the way that multiple fathers go into defining what we do and how we act and things like that, would bear in some ways many closer similarities between Jewish traditions and Orthodox Eastern Christians, especially if we want to add Semitic traditions in the Arab world, than you might have between Catholicism and Judaism, in my view. And I think that's something, maybe just because of my own personal perspective, but we need to address more often.
Thank you for bringing that into the discussion. It wasn't my intention to not to talk about Orthodox Christianity. What the matchmaking I would see there is the distinct and wonderful emphasis on incarnation as the starting point for God's oikonomia. That God is present in this world, and in the Mishkan and the Shekhinah, and that we see that in the prologue of John, and that no family in the Christian, no part of the Christian family picks that up to the same degree as does Orthodox Christianity, with this emphasis on God's presence in this world. So I'll have to keep thinking of the matchmaking here, but the Johannine Logos Christology and Orthodox Christianity is so important. And I mean, speaking as a Protestant, with this our emphasis on Good Friday, almost isolated from not only Easter Day but also Christmas Day, and there I find it so helpful to be in dialogue with Orthodox thinkers, both in antiquity and in now in contemporary theologians. Ruth, are you chairing this session, or I am? Sorry. Well, then I should be chairing it and not respond. I see also Peter Fan, to everyone, recall Rosemary Ruther's comment that anti-Judaism is the left hand of Christology. And that may be to everyone, or is it especially to Daniel Boyarin, perhaps?
I totally disagree with Rosemary on that, as much as I honor her. I think that that the high Christology of the Gospel of John, for instance, or even of the Synoptics, is a direct continuation of one of strands of Jewish thought about the Messiah at the time. There are versions of Christology, of course, as we well know. But precisely what we're doing here is a kind of archaeological excavation of possibilities for Christology, ecclesiology, etc., that are before the 4th century, that are before the crystallization. The Council of Nicaea is to finally separate Jews from Christians. That's the point of it. So, yeah.
Thank you. It's past, not only in Boston, but also in Sweden. So maybe we shall call it a day, and we'll open the breakout room. So I would like to thank all today's speakers and our respondent. I hope all of you will be able and willing to join us for the second session on Sunday next week. And you have already heard some of the speakers, so you know that it will be a rewarding experience. So welcome back. Thank you very much. And I hand the microphone to Ruth if you have some practical information. Otherwise, it's been a wonderful first day of this two-day conference.
Yeah, thank you, Jesper. Thank you so much for pulling the conference together, bringing this community of people together. And again, thank you also to all of the speakers today. The breakout rooms will be open for people who would like to bring their own glass of wine and stay around and chat for a little while. Otherwise, the formal discussions are over today.